Picture this. Millions of people around the world recognize a piece of music instantly. Those eerie, pulsing electronic sounds that signal the TARDIS is about to materialize. For decades, viewers heard it every single week, their hearts racing as that otherworldly theme swept them into adventure. But here's what almost nobody knew. The person who created those revolutionary sounds, who literally invented techniques that wouldn't become mainstream for another 30 years, was a woman working in a BBC basement whose name was deliberately kept out of the credits. This isn't just another story about a talented woman being overlooked. This is about someone who fundamentally changed how we think about music itself, who turned sound into an art form that didn't even have a name yet, and who did it all with equipment so primitive that what she accomplished should have been physically impossible. And when her male boss tried to get her the credit she deserved, the BBC said no. They had policies about that sort of thing. By the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly how one woman's genius was systematically buried by institutional sexism, and how the sounds she created in 1963 are still influencing the music you hear today. Because Delia Derbyshire didn't just compose the Doctor Who theme, she invented electronic music as we know it, and almost nobody knew her name until after she died. The story begins in 1940, with a 3-year-old girl listening to sounds that would haunt and inspire her for the rest of her life. Delia Derbyshire was born on May 5, 1937, in Coventry, England, and her earliest memories were of terror and wonder mixed together in the darkness. When she was just 3 years old, the German Luftwaffe began systematically bombing her city in what would become known as the Coventry Blitz. Night after night, the air raid sirens would wail their distinctive electronic tone, a sound that existed completely outside the world of traditional music. Then came the explosions, the rumbling that shook the earth, and finally, when the bombers had passed, the all-clear signal with its own unique electronic voice. Most children would have been simply traumatized by this. Delia absorbed it all like a strange kind of symphony. These weren't instruments creating these sounds. They were pure electronic tones, mechanical voices, speaking a language that had nothing to do with pianos or violins or anything humans had used to make music for thousands of years. Something in her 3-year-old brain recognized these sounds as something new, something that moved her in ways she couldn't articulate but would never forget. As the war ended and Coventry rebuilt itself from the rubble, Delia's intellectual abilities became impossible to ignore. Despite coming from a working-class background in a time when that usually meant limited opportunities, especially for girls, she was brilliant. Not just smart, genuinely, undeniably brilliant. She earned scholarships that would take her places her family could have never afforded. First to Bars Hill Grammar School, where she excelled in everything, and then to something that seemed almost impossible, Cambridge University. At Cambridge, she chose to study both mathematics and music, a combination that would have raised eyebrows even if she'd been a man. But as a young woman in the late 1950s, walking into rooms full of men who believed she was biologically incapable of understanding complex mathematics, the hostility wasn't even subtle. Her professors and fellow students made it clear, day after day, that she was an intruder in their world. But here's what they didn't understand. Delia wasn't just good at mathematics and music separately. She saw how they connected to each other in ways that nobody else was seeing yet. She understood that sound could be manipulated mathematically, that music could be built from numbers and precision in ways that went beyond traditional composition. When she graduated from Cambridge with that unusual dual degree, she thought her unique skills would open doors. She approached Decca Records in 1959, one of the biggest recording companies in Britain, and inquired about working in their studios. The response was blunt and devastating. Decca didn't employ women in their studios. Not, "We don't have any positions available right now." Not, "You're not qualified." Just a flat statement that their recording studios were male spaces and she would never be allowed in. Think about that for a moment. a Cambridge University graduate with expertise in both the artistic and technical sides of sound, was told that her gender made her unfit to even enter a recording studio. This wasn't just one company's policy, this was the industry standard. The men who would go on to become famous producers and engineers often had far less education and natural talent than Delia, but they had one qualification she lacked. They were men. Delia could have given up at that point. Many women did, because what was the alternative? But in 1960, she found a different door to walk through. The BBC was hiring trainee studio managers, and while it wasn't glamorous, it was at least a foot in the door. She took the position knowing she was capable of so much more and began learning the technical side of radio production. And then, in 1962, she heard about something that would change everything. Tucked away in the basement of the BBC's Maida Vale studios was something that didn't quite fit anywhere in the corporation's organizational structure. They called it the BBC Radiophonic Workshop, and it had been created in 1958 to produce sound effects for radio and television programs. But it wasn't quite a music department, and it wasn't quite a sound effect department, and the people who worked there were doing things with sound that nobody had quite figured out how to categorize yet. Delia maneuvered her way into the workshop in 1962, and the moment she walked into that basement, surrounded by tape recorders, oscillators, and early synthesizers, she knew she'd found her home. This was a place where the normal rules didn't apply because nobody had written the rules yet. This was where you could take sound itself and bend it, stretch it, cut it apart, and rebuild it into something that had never existed before. While the rest of the BBC worked with traditional musicians and orchestras, the Radiophonic Workshop was conducting experiments that most people didn't even understand. The equipment they worked with would look absurdly primitive by today's standards. There were no computers, no digital samplers, no software that could manipulate sound with a mouse click. Every single sound had to be created through physical manipulation. You'd record something onto magnetic tape, then use a razor blade to cut that tape into pieces, splice those pieces together in different orders, change the playback speed to alter the pitch, and layer multiple tape machines on top of each other to create complexity. It was painstaking, mathematical, physically demanding work that required both artistic vision and technical precision. In other words, it was perfect for someone with Delia's unique combination of skills. While other Radiophonic Workshop members created interesting sound effects, Delia saw possibilities that went beyond mere background noises. She understood that these techniques could be used to create actual music, compositions that existed in a sonic space that traditional instruments could never reach. And she began creating pieces that were hauntingly beautiful, utterly alien, and completely unprecedented. And then in 1963, a composer named Ron Grainer walked into the workshop carrying a piece of paper that would test everything Delia had learned. The BBC was launching a new science fiction television series called Doctor Who, and Grainer had composed a theme for it. But his score was barely even music in the traditional sense. It was more like a sketch, a suggestion of an idea. He'd scribbled down a basic melody with vague directions written next to it like sweeps, bubbles, and clouds. These weren't musical terms. They were attempts to describe sounds that didn't exist yet, sounds that would need to be invented. The BBC handed this skeletal sketch to Delia and basically said, "See what you can do with this." What happened next would change television history, electronic music history, and Delia's life, though not in the ways it should have.
Let me describe to you exactly how primitive the technology was that Delia was working with in 1963, because this matters. When we talk about electronic music today, we imagine computers, synthesizers with thousands of preset sounds, software that can generate any imaginable tone instantly. Delia had none of that. What she had was magnetic tape, razor blades, oscillators that could produce basic electronic tones, and her own mathematical precision. To create the bass line for the Doctor Who theme, Delia took a single string, plucked it, recorded that sound, and then manipulated the playback speed until it produced the exact pitch she needed. Then she cut that piece of tape to the exact length required for the rhythm she wanted. Then she had to do it again for every single note in the bass line, cutting and splicing dozens of pieces of tape with mathematical precision so they'd play in the right sequence at the right tempo. For the swooping, alien sounds that would become the theme's signature, she sat at an oscillator and manually manipulated it, recording take after take until she captured exactly the right curve of sound, the right emotional quality. Then those recordings had to be cut, timed, and layered with the other elements. The rhythmic patterns required cutting hundreds of tiny pieces of tape and splicing them together in sequences that she'd calculated mathematically beforehand. Every single sound you hear in that iconic theme was created through this agonizing process of physical manipulation. What would take seconds with modern technology took Delia weeks of painstaking labor, her hands cramping from holding razor blades, her eyes straining to cut tape with millimeter precision, her brain constantly calculating the mathematical relationships between sounds. And she wasn't just copying Ron Grainer's basic melody. She was transforming it into something he'd never imagined, adding layers of complexity and emotional depth that existed only in her mind until she physically carved them into existence, one tape splice at a time. The final composition was so far beyond what anyone expected that when Grainer first heard it, he was stunned into silence. Then he asked a question that reveals everything. "Did I write that?" Delia's response was characteristically modest. Most of it. But here's the thing. Grainer recognized genius when he heard it. This wasn't just a competent realization of his sketch. This was groundbreaking work that had elevated his simple melody into something that sounded like it had been transmitted from the future. He immediately went to the BBC and insisted that Delia receive co-composer credit and royalties. She'd done far more than arrange his theme. She'd co-created it, bringing techniques and ideas that hadn't existed in Grainer's original score. The BBC's response was swift and absolute. No. Their policy stated that Radiophonic workshop employees remained anonymous. Their names didn't appear in credits. They were considered technical support, not artists, regardless of how creative their work actually was. Delia had created one of the most innovative and influential pieces of electronic music in history, something that would be heard by millions of people every single week for decades, and the corporation that employed her had an official policy that her name would never appear in connection with it. Think about the psychology of that for a moment. The BBC wasn't denying that Delia had done brilliant work. They were saying that their internal policies about how to categorize certain employees mattered more than giving credit where credit was obviously due. And while these policies sounded neutral on paper, let's be honest about who they actually protected and who they erased. The famous composers whose names appeared in credits, almost all men. The anonymous technical support staff in the basement, that's where they could hide the women. Ron Grainer would receive royalties every single time the Doctor Who theme played. Delia received her standard BBC salary and nothing more. Her name was deliberately kept invisible while her genius became one of the most recognizable pieces of music in television history. But the Doctor Who theme was just the beginning of Delia's output, and here's where the story gets even more remarkable. Throughout the 1960s, while officially anonymous, Delia was creating hundreds of groundbreaking compositions and sound designs. She worked on programs like Tomorrow's World, on countless BBC educational broadcasts, on theatrical productions and experimental films. Each piece showcased techniques that were decades ahead of their time. She wasn't just working at the BBC either. Delia co-founded Unit Delta Plus, an electronic music studio and collective that organized some of the first electronic music events in Britain. She worked with the Kaleidophone studio, collaborated with avant-garde artists like Yoko Ono, and produced some of the most experimental electronic music of the era. Much of this work remained unreleased during her lifetime, sitting in archives because the world wasn't quite ready for sounds this far ahead of the curve. And let me emphasize again just how primitive her tools were. Modern electronic musicians work with equipment that can generate and manipulate millions of sounds instantly. Delia's process for creating a single unique sound might take hours or days of physical labor. She'd record environmental sounds, a lamppost being struck, water dripping, metal scraping, and then transform them through manipulation into something unrecognizable, but musically perfect. She calculates the exact length of tape needed to produce a specific rhythm, then cut hundreds of these pieces and splice them together by hand. She layered tape machines, carefully calculating the mathematical relationships between frequencies to create harmonies that sounded otherworldly. And what she was doing required not just creativity, but extraordinary patience, physical dexterity, and mathematical genius. It was like sculpting music out of sound itself, one microscopic piece at a time. And the results were so far ahead of contemporary music that many listeners couldn't even process what they were hearing. These weren't just interesting sound effects. These were genuine compositions that wouldn't have mainstream equivalents until decades later. But here's what makes the story particularly devastating. By the early 1970s, the very success of electronic music was beginning to work against Delia. Commercial synthesizers were hitting the market, machines that could produce at the push of a button what Delia had spent weeks creating by hand. Suddenly, electronic music was becoming accessible to people who didn't have her technical skills or her innovative vision. The handcrafted approach she'd mastered was being replaced by mass production. And through all this, the BBC's policies hadn't changed. She was still anonymous, still uncredited, still watching other people, usually men, receive recognition for work that she had pioneered. The frustration, the institutional dismissal, the knowledge that she'd invented techniques that others were now being celebrated for discovering, it was grinding her down. In 1973, Delia left the BBC. She didn't retire to a comfortable career built on the royalties and recognition she deserved because she'd never received either. She just walked away. She took a series of random jobs that had nothing to do with music, working at a bookshop, at a museum, even as a radio operator for British Gas. For nearly 30 decades, one of the most innovative electronic music composers of the 20th century gradually faded into obscurity, while her influential work continued to inspire a new generation of musicians who had absolutely no idea who she was. The absence of credit and compensation didn't just rob Delia of recognition, it destroyed her financially and psychologically. While Ron Greener collected royalties every time the Doctor Who theme played anywhere in the world, Delia struggled to pay rent. The corporation that had benefited enormously from her genius had enforced policies that kept her invisible and then let her drift away with nothing. And let's be clear about what those royalties meant. We're not talking about modest payments. The Doctor Who theme became one of the most played pieces of television music in history, broadcast in dozens of countries, licensed for countless uses. The money flowing from Delia's work was substantial. None of it went to her. Her personal life unraveled. She struggled with alcoholism, with depression, with the bitter knowledge that her revolutionary contributions had been systematically erased. The woman who had once manipulated sound with mathematical precision, who had turned the primitive equipment of the early 1960s into an instrument for creating the future, was working minimum wage jobs and drinking to dull the pain of being forgotten. Think about the psychological toll of that. Imagine creating something genuinely revolutionary, something that millions of people hear and love, and watching the world celebrate everyone except you. Imagine knowing that you invented techniques that are now industry standard and watching younger musicians being hailed as pioneers for discovering things you'd done 30 years earlier. Imagine the BBC having entire documentaries about the history of electronic music that barely mention your name, if they mention it at all. This wasn't just oversight. This was the result of deliberate institutional policies that kept women's contributions invisible. Policies that sounded neutral, but functioned to ensure that men received credit and compensation while women remained in the basement, anonymous and underpaid.
But here's what the institutions that erased Delia didn't count on. Music has a way of outlasting the people who try to bury it. And in the late 1990s, something remarkable started to happen. A new generation of electronic musicians was emerging, artists like Aphex Twin, Orbital, and the Chemical Brothers, who were pushing the boundaries of what electronic music could be. And as they explored the history of their genre, they kept encountering something mysterious. References to techniques and compositions from the 1960s that shouldn't have been possible with the technology of that era. Sounds that were far too sophisticated, too innovative, too ahead of their time. They started digging and they kept finding the same name buried in obscure BBC credits, Delia Derbyshire. Music journalists began investigating, trying to understand who this woman was and how she'd created sounds that still sounded futuristic 30 years later. In 1998, a radio documentary about her work brought Delia back into public consciousness, though she largely avoided the spotlight that was finally, belatedly being offered to her. Why did she avoid it? Maybe because recognition after 3 decades of erasure feels less like justice and more like an insult. Maybe because being celebrated in her 60s for work she had done in her 20s just highlighted everything she had been denied in between. Maybe because the depression and alcoholism had done their damage and she was simply too exhausted to engage with the fame she deserved all along. Delia died on July 3, 2001, at the age of 64. And only then, only after she could no longer speak for herself, did the obituaries finally acknowledge what should have been obvious from the beginning, that she was one of the most important and innovative electronic music composers of the 20th century. The BBC, decades too late, began to acknowledge her contribution to the Doctor Who theme and her broader impact on electronic music. In 2008, researchers discovered her personal tape archive containing over 300 recordings that revealed the true breadth of her genius. Universities now study her techniques, musicians sample her work, documentaries celebrate her innovations. And in 2013, 50 years after she created the Doctor Who theme, her name was finally added to the credits of the show. 50 years. Half a century after creating one of the most iconic pieces of television music in history, Delia Derbyshire's name finally appeared in connection with her work. Delia Derbyshire didn't just create sounds that were ahead of their time. She created techniques and approaches that are still being discovered and appreciated today. Working with equipment that should have made what she accomplished impossible, facing institutional sexism that tried to keep her anonymous, she forged an entirely new way of thinking about music and sound. The next time you hear those eerie, pulsing notes signaling that the TARDIS is about to materialize, remember the woman in the BBC basement who created them. Remember that she invented the future of music, while the institutions around her tried to pretend she didn't exist. Remember Delia Derbyshire, the woman who taught us that sound itself could be sculpted into art, and whose genius was finally recognized only after it was too late to give her the life she deserved. Her name is Delia Derbyshire, and now, finally, we all know it.
If this story made you angry, if it inspired you, if it made you wonder who else has been erased, then you need to subscribe to this channel right now.
Because if we don't tell these stories, who will? And if we don't remember these women, who else gets forgotten tomorrow?
They can steal credit, they can rewrite papers, they can dominate textbooks, but they can't stop us from finding the truth and sharing it.
That's why you need to subscribe to Women Erased. Let's rewrite history together.